My name is Charles Bone. Today is August the 5th of 2019. I'm in Nashville, Tennessee to interview a star of the Tennessee bar, Carol McCoy. This interview is taking place as a part of the history project of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Carol, would you tell us your full name?
Carol Louise McCoy.
And your date and place of birth?
Kingsport, September 4th, 1947.
And tell us about your birth family, your parents, grandparents, so forth.
My grandparents on my mother's side was Poppy Barnes. He was a stonemason, lived in Philadelphia. And my grandmother was born in Ireland and came to the United States probably 1902, 1903. My mother was born in Philadelphia, the oldest of three, and she had a twin brother and sister. On my father's side, he was one of 13 children, 9 who survived. He's one of the real McCoys from East Kentucky. John Wesley McCoy was my grandfather, and Mary McCoy, Mary Blankenship, was my grandmother. My father's name was Nelson McCoy, and he was the middle of the 9. My mother's name was Catherine Florence Barnes, and when she met my father, she was a medical technician, and my father was a pilot in the Air Force.
Wow. So you might as well, because you've raised everybody's expectations about the Hatfields and the McCoys. So you are a real McCoy.
That's true. And when I married, I told my husband, Roger Page, that I was a real McCoy. I have a book with the genealogy in the back of it, and he went through it and he said, I am really sorry to tell you, but I don't think you're a direct descendant of Randolph McCoy, which I thought was an error. So I called one of my sisters. I have 3 sisters and a brother. Sister number 3 straightened him out and said, that's because you're looking at the male line. Randolph McCoy's daughter married her first cousin, who was also a McCoy. And that's why it looked as though I wasn't a direct descendant.
So it's been confirmed. And for some of the younger members of our audience, would you maybe just give us a little detail about what we mean when we talk about the Hatfields and the McCoys?
Throughout the United States in the 1800s, there were areas of the country in which certain families had feuds. And in Appalachia, one of the more famous and notorious feuds was between the Hatfields and the McCoys. Both of the Hatfield and McCoy senior member, Devil Anse Hatfield, and Randolph McCoy served in the Civil War. Devil Anse abandoned the war, and according to my side of the story, he started staking a claim on a lot of the property and animal stock that belonged to other people, including the McCoys. And when Randolph McCoy came back, it generated hard feelings. As a consequence of the hard feelings, there were feuds, one of which arose when the Hatfields stole one of the McCoys' pigs, or a hog. And there is the 5 McCoys that were involved in a dispute on Election Day in which a fight broke out. Devil Anse Hatfield's brother was stabbed by some of the McCoys. He didn't die right away, but lingered. And Devil Anse said, if he dies, there'll be retribution, which was an ambush of 5 McCoys who were tied to the pawpaw trees and murdered. Now that's part of the feud history, according to this McCoy.
And so we might as well go ahead and finish that story. You've actually been on TV to tell part of that story?
I didn't tell that part of the story. I was invited to be a surprise guest on Anderson Cooper's show when he was interviewing Kevin Costner. Kevin Costner did a 5-part miniseries for TV, which I think you can still see, playing Devil Anse Hatfield. I thought he played the wrong role. And it's a pretty bloody 5-part series because Devil Anse Hatfield actually burned down Randolph McCoy's home, and one, I think, of his daughters died in the fire. It's a pretty messy movie, but as a consequence, I was invited to go to New York and be a surprise Real McCoy guest. My son was dating the social media person for Anderson Cooper. He also had a surprise for me, and that was Linda Hatfield. And as it turned out, I got to meet Anderson Cooper, Kevin Costner, shake their hands, and listen to the television interview.
And does the feud go on? I mean, is there still
No.
animosity?
No. Matewan, West Virginia, is one of the places where they congregate, and there is a softball game every summer between the Hatfields and the McCoys, starting about 1990. So they've had a reconciliation, just like Ireland and Northern Ireland.
Great.
I hope it stays that way.
And have you been to the softball game? Or
I haven't been to the softball game, but I have been to West Virginia and East Kentucky to see my grandmother and my grandfather. They lived in a company town. And for people who don't know what a company town is, my grandfather worked for the railroad. He was not a coal miner, which was pretty much the occupation of people who lived in East Kentucky and West Virginia. The company supplied a house on the side of a mountain, and those houses were wooden. They were heated by wood-burning stoves and sometimes by coal. I know because I got a nickel a bucket going up the 95 stairs from the coal bin on the side of the road. And as you went up the flight of stairs, you'd come to a platform about every 35 steps, thank you, Lord. And then when you got to about 50, it split. And one side went off to one house and one side went off to the other house. It had no indoor plumbing initially, so there was an outhouse, but by the time we were visiting, they had installed indoor plumbing. The lights were on a long black electrical cord. There was one in each room. That was the only electricity. And at 10 o'clock, the electricity went off. 6 a.m. it got on, but my grandmother got up at 4 o'clock to start heating the stove, and that's why she needed the coal.
Wow, what a story. That's amazing. So tell us about your family, your sisters and a brother.
I do. I have 3 sisters and a brother. I'm number 2. Margaret McCoy Dean is retired from the Foreign Service. She was more or less a trade minister, and towards the end of her career, she was the finance minister to Italy. She temporarily served as the ambassador to Italy when the ambassador retired at the change of administration, and the then acting ambassador would leave, and it fell to her to be the acting ambassador. She lives in Arlington. I'm number 2. Number 3 is Mary Catherine McCoy. She lives in Tampa, Florida. She had a career in marketing for General Foods and Valvoline. Sister number 4 is Judy McCoy, and she lives in Saline, Michigan, and works for Paul Smith College in the Adirondacks, doing corporate management and corporate recruiting. Paul Smith has one of the largest forestry colleges and culinary colleges, and she was lured there by the owner of the Palm, who is a graduate. So my brother, John Wesley McCoy, which caused the priest to kind of choke. I didn't mention that my father is from the hills, and he really was not a participating member of any faith. But if I had to guess, I'd say it was Methodist. with John Wesley as his father's name. And my mother went to a private parochial school in Philadelphia and was very Catholic, and we were all sent to Catholic schools except for my brother because my father did not think a boy should be going to a Catholic school. So there's a little difference of opinion.
Yeah. So where is your brother now?
My brother lives in Vero Beach. He's a city planner, and he was married to the former city attorney. My sister-in-law was a lawyer, and she did a lot of municipal law and resisted as long as she could. She didn't want to be the city attorney, but she's retired.
Good. So what a successful group of people, and I know you're proud of them.
Thank you.
So now tell us about your childhood. Based on my knowledge, you don't have to tell us the name of every school you went to, but tell us that experience.
I mentioned I was born in Kingsport. My oldest sister was born in Philadelphia. Sister number 3 was born in Austin, Texas, and sister number 4 and brother 5 were born in Madison, Wisconsin. I went to school in first grade, Louisiana and Alaska. Third grade, Alaska and Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, we moved from Sun Prairie into Madison. I went to high school in Madison, Wiesbaden, Germany, and Tampa, Florida. Then I went to the University of South Florida. Halfway through that, I did a work-study program for the State Department in New York City, right after the 10-day lightning war that Israel had. I think it was in 67, and I was in New York City from January of 68 to September of, 67, 68. I graduated in December of 69 because I'd taken time off to do the work-study program.
Now, why did you go to all of these schools?
I mentioned that my father was a pilot in the Air Force.
Okay.
And one of the circumstances is that he was transferred about every 2 years. That meant that he picked up his little tribe, and we moved every 2 to 3 years depending on his assignment. If you haven't lived in the military, it might seem very strange about these moves, but to me it became very routine, except for my senior year, when halfway through my senior year we had to go back to the States, and the class trip was to Rome, Italy. I was very unhappy about that. I don't think that happened to anybody else, because when my sister number 1 was we were living in Wisconsin, and Daddy was transferred. He went to Germany without us in January. We stayed until she graduated and went over there in August of 65. So she went on to the University of Kentucky without having to split up her senior year.
Poor Carol.
Should I shed a tear here?
Let's don't do that yet. Let's talk about your childhood, though. So you had an amazing childhood with a lot of different schools and a lot of different places that you lived, and tell us about how you kept friends from all of those places, or did you keep friends from any of those places during that period of time?
I think it would be fair to say that you don't keep very many friends from your childhood because you have no way of knowing. I have vivid memories of some. My friend from Wiesbaden, Germany, the first friend that I had was Barbara Kleffel, and I went to her wedding in Toronto, Canada. She was a war baby. She spoke fluent German and didn't know that she was born in Germany until her stepfather was reassigned back to Wiesbaden, and I've stayed in touch with her. I have also stayed in touch with many of my classmates from Wiesbaden High School, and we have high school reunions around the United States. We have reunions in Las Vegas and New Orleans and Chicago and Atlanta and Denver, and they came to Nashville which was pretty exciting because I didn't invite them. And I was the only one here. Oh. I think looking back, it was a blessing in a way. I also was very unhappy because I always had to leave my friends, and you were only allowed to take so much weight-wise when we moved. So you also lost a lot of your possessions. And when I got to Nashville, in a sense, it was as it always had been. I didn't know anybody, but it also was a lesson for me that sometimes having deep roots provides you with a lot of advantages that people who are transient don't have.
So you mentioned when you got to Nashville. How did you get to Nashville and when?
I came to Nashville the first time in August of 1970 because, as I mentioned, I graduated in December of 1969, and on a fluke, I went to see the president of my former sorority who lived in Miami, Coral Gables. I went to see her just for a visit. She was working full-time, and I thought, I'll go to an employment agency and see about getting a job as a trial experience. I didn't know where I was going to go after I graduated from college, but I thought, it'll be interesting to see how I would do in an interview. They sent me to IBM on Biscayne Boulevard. I went down to IBM, interviewed, came back to the house. The lady called me up and said, they want you to come and work for them. And I said, well, I don't live here. I'd have to ask my friend if I could stay with her. And I said, she says, ask her. And I said, but I don't have a car. I'd have to ask my daddy if I could take one of his cars. He had 5 Volkswagens. And ask him. One thing I've noticed about pushy people is when they tell me, do this, I do it. So I asked. Ended up working in Miami. But before I had left law school, I applied to 5 law schools and 5 colleges. 5 graduate schools and 5 law schools. I had interviewed with the FBI when I was in college. They never told me they didn't hire women as agents at that time. And I told these people at IBM, I am going to go either to graduate school or law school when I've saved $1,000. And they said, okay. I am sure they never thought that I would. Tuition at Vanderbilt was $1,800 a year. Second week in February, I heard from Vanderbilt that I had been accepted. Second week, they told me I had a half tuition scholarship, which helped tremendously. And then I heard from Duke, and they had put me on their waiting list, but I had to let Vanderbilt know right away. So I told them yes. But I had never been to Vanderbilt. I had never been to Nashville. And I didn't have a car, if you will remember. So when I told my father that I was thinking about going to law school, he was not very supportive. There's several great things that he said, such as, why do you want to go to law school? Going to law school is like being a prostitute. All you do is sell your services. Second thing he said is, if you're serious and you go to law school, you will be over 25. You will be over the hill, and you better be prepared to support yourself for the rest of your life. I have to say, there wasn't a lot of encouragement, but I had that half tuition scholarship. And so I came.
And how did you decide on law school? Did you know any lawyers? How did you become interested in the law?
Perry Mason, I watched him faithfully, and I majored in political science. I had one professor who was a labor management lawyer, more on the management side, that I met. He wasn't a professor or anything, but that's about the only lawyer that I ever knew. I did it by a process of elimination. I knew I couldn't be a doctor because I can't stand to see people bleed. I thought about being an accountant because I'm pretty good with numbers, but I thought it would be so dull and I would never see people. When I thought about the law, I thought, You're involved with people. You're going to be helping them. You will learn an awful lot. That was the basis on which I went to law school. And that's all I knew about law school. I didn't know anything.
So you arrived in Nashville for the first time?
Yes.
In
1970, August.
August of 1970.
I have a memorable story of being there that first week. The first year class comes a week early to get oriented, and I was one of 4 women in my class of 163. I had not been there maybe 2 or 3 days, but I knew I had to buy my books. And I was standing at the corkboard with my arms full of books on the second floor, and this man in a suit came up to me and he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to go to law school." And he said, "Don't you know a woman's place is at home, pregnant and bearing babies?" And now, I had not heard that before. And I looked at this man because I thought he was mentally ill, but he proceeded for 20 minutes. I kept thinking, I've got to get away from him. But there was nobody else on this floor, and I was kind of backing up, but he wouldn't let up. That was Weird Harold Bigham, my professor for procedure, civil procedure, my first year. The other interesting first year story is that during that same week, I was living at the Barbizon, which was like half a block from the Vanderbilt Law School. I was going across the intersection, and this man in a frock coat with a tall hat on said, "Miss, miss!" And I looked over, and again, I'm the only one out at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a hot day. This fellow has on a long coat. And I thought, who is that? He's coming with big giant steps towards me. And I started walking faster and faster, and he started walking faster, but I got to the law school before he could get me. I found out that that was John J. Hooker. He was running for governor, and he was trying to find somebody to talk to, man or woman on the street, for a TV commercial that they were making. He just wanted to talk to me. That was not my only encounter with John Jay over the years, but that was my first encounter.
And do you remember the other 3 women who were in your class?
Oh, absolutely. Emily Scarborough. She became a bank trust officer up in Boston, and she died of breast cancer about 20 years ago. Emily Rocker Fontecchio, who now is retired from the Department of Human Services. She was staff counsel over there, and she now teaches bridge on White Bridge Road. And Patsy Porter Crider Flynn Gagnier, who is a lawyer with a tax degree.
Wow. 4 women in the class that started in 1970.
There were 11 women in the law school. I will say we started with 5, but Emily, I can't remember Emily's last name. She left after December. She was so homesick she didn't stay with us.
So we've kind of skipped over your college career in South Florida, which sounds like a really nice place to go to college. Was that a good experience?
I lived at home during college, so the experience was a little bit different until my mother said that I could live on campus for a little while. I think most of what I've done has been a good experience, so I'll say yes, my college experience was fairly good. I pledged a sorority. I became vice president Panhellenic. I was very active in the sorority, but I was also appalled when I was vice president Panhellenic that they did not take people who were Jewish. I didn't know that. And that really soured me on the whole experience. And by going to New York in my junior year, I more or less took a hiatus and did not really participate after that. I didn't think it was right.
Well, then let's go back to law school.
Okay.
So did you like law school?
No.
You did not like law school. Did
No.
you like any of the professors other than Bigham?
I had a fabulous professor. Professor Hartman was my contracts professor. John Marshall was my UCC professor. I see him occasionally. I have very fond memories of some of my professors. I had Dean Wade for torts, and he was a perfect gentleman. I had wonderful classmates. The reason I didn't like it, it was a miserable experience. I was so alone. I thought it was going to be like college, where you'd have friends. Half of my class were returning Vietnam vets. They were usually married. Sam Bartholomew, Wish Beasley, Stafford McNamee. They were all business. And then the other half were people who were right out of college. And I did not realize that law school for many of these people is a very serious step in their career goals. I was there to figure out what life was about. They were gunners. We had one who stole a copy of the USCA that was critical for finding the answer to a writing exercise. I didn't know people did things like that. So it was pretty lonely. I had a group of guys that I got to eat lunch with. And during the first year, if you went to Vanderbilt, you know that you have your sections, your A's and your B's, and I was put in section A, which is the early risers. I'm not an early riser. I was meant to be a princess and wake up at 11, but somebody else got that job. So I was in the A group, and because I was a unique individual, I knew everybody in both sections. I think I knew everybody by first name in my whole class.
A little bit of a politician already?
Well, I didn't think so, but I think I'm just friendly. Mm.
So, what did you do well?
I don't think I did well. I think when you have a professor like Bigham, that while it's supposed to be anonymous grading, that it wasn't so anonymous. And I think that I have looked back and I think what has been one of my biggest flaws. I think writing is one of the flaws that I have tried very hard to improve on. But when you look at how often I moved, there wasn't really consistency sometimes in the education that I got. I was learning phonics in first grade, and then when I moved in the middle of first grade, they didn't have phonics anymore. So it doesn't do any good to go back and look at where you had a glitch in your education, but it does have a compounding effect. And so writing in law is a very useful skill. It's very essential. And it's something that I have tried to improve on once I understood that that's what you're supposed to do. And it took me a while to learn how to write in a legal sense. I find it very hard now to read fiction because I'm mostly interested in the facts and in the analysis and in the outcome. And all of the scene setting and the descriptive words, they're just kind of nice, but they sure take up a lot of space.
Great. So did you work during law school?
I did. My father paid for each child's 4-year education. After that, you were on your own. He thought he'd done his duty when they were 18. Anything above that was extra. Given his background and how much he did to be a successful person, if I could do as much as my father did, I would have been president of the United States. He came from nothing. And one day I asked him, if you're so smart, how come you're not rich and famous? And he said, why would I want to be rich and famous? I have everything that I want. And if I want good company, I go off by myself.
He and Thomas Jefferson.
Yes. And so my first year I worked in the law library, and I also got a night job working for a PR agency in Green Hills at night. One of the things I learned at IBM is how to use their magnetic tape selective typewriter and new computers a little bit. So I was useful in that sense. I had to find jobs in order to supplement what I borrowed to help pay for law school.
That's great. And did you work during the summers as well?
Oh, yes, I did. The first year, I went and worked for a labor law firm. Bella Abzug was a congresswoman in New York City, and I thought, that sounds like a perfect job. I could be a lawyer for people who work, labor. That's what I thought. And she was pretty feisty. I am not a feisty person. I am not a confrontational person, and I just admired her, thought she was great. The women's movement was very big at the time, and I was having a dawning of awareness from other women. So I went and worked for this labor law firm on the management side as a part-time temp in the evening, because I worked from 9 to 5 at Montgomery Ward's in the women's department. And then from 6 to 9, I worked for the law firm. After my second year, I called up the law firm and said, and I should tell you, I interviewed for a position with a law firm in San Francisco when they came to Vanderbilt. And I had a great interview with this law firm, and the fellow said, we're going to hire you. I'm offering you a position. So I went out and told the woman who helped at Vanderbilt with all of the placement that I'd been offered a clerkship for the summer between my second and third year. She said, that's fabulous. As a result, I didn't interview anymore. 2 weeks after it was all over, he'd gone back to San Francisco, and they said, we can't have a woman. She'll get pregnant and she'll quit work. So I didn't get the clerkship, and I didn't have anything to do that summer. I'd been planning on going to California, so I had to call my mother and my father and say, I'm going to come home. And I did what I said. I called the law firm and asked if I could have a full-time job during the summer. I wanted to be a clerk, and they said, okay. But because I had worked there the year before, I actually ended up being a secretary. I didn't get to do any of the writing. I didn't get to do any research. They just kept piling on what they had piled on the summer before when I was there in the evening.
So then what about the end of law school then? So what did you...
Now,
yeah.
One of the things that happened in law school is that I met a fellow named Jim Bryan. And he and I were classmates. He had been in the other section, so I really didn't know him that well. We ended up getting married in August before my third year. And during that time period, he started working in the evenings for Woods & Woods, a law firm in Nashville, 2 graduates from the Vanderbilt Law School, Frank Woods and Jane Ann Woods. And I got to know them. I studied with Charlie Ray, a classmate of mine who was into labor law, and Jim Bryan. We had a little study group. We took the bar. I applied several places in Nashville, but I really didn't find anybody that was willing to hire a woman. I had a friend, Lynn Todd Edgerton, who said, I'm leaving town, you can have my position, go down and talk to them. And they said, well, maybe we could use you in estates and trusts. And I thought, estates and trusts? That doesn't sound like a real job. So that was the only offer I got, but I did get hired by Legal Services. And at that time, Legal Services was brand new. I had an office at Matthew Walker Health Center in the basement in a cement room with no windows. There was one other lawyer there, and until we had Joe Brown show up. And I learned about poverty law. I never really knew people who were poor until I worked at Legal Services, and I did not know the problems of the poor. And that was a very big education. That was my first job. And after I had worked there for about 2 years, my marriage didn't seem to be working out. And Jane Ann Woods had just become the Commissioner of Revenue. And the week that I knew I was going to get divorced, my divorce took 2 weeks. Filed, and I got divorced in 2 weeks. I could tell you how that happened, but we won't dally here. She called me up in the middle of those 2 weeks and said, would you like to come and work at the Department of Revenue? And I said, Jane Ann, I don't know a thing about tax. She said, that's not really why I want you to come. She said, I need to know who in the department is really working, who is doing a good job, and I would like to have somebody that I can trust. And I said, I will come. At that point, I had learned a lot at legal services. I've been going to court almost every day. When you work at the Department of Revenue, you don't go to court at all. And it was a total change. I was used to working from the time I got there at 8 until 8 at night or 9 at night. There was just so much you had to do. It was a very calm place to work. People drank coffee and they chatted. And at 4:30, there was a vacuum cleaner that came and just sucked everybody out of the building. And I was still there at 6 or 7 o'clock at night. And people told me I was making them look bad because I was working too long. That was strange. I had been there about 5 months when the former president of the Bar Association, Louis Farrell, came by my office. I did not know the man. He said, I saw you in court when you were practicing with legal services. You were in probate court, and I really admired the way that you handled yourself. If you're ever interested in going into private practice, let me know. I said, I'm very interested. I will tell you now that had I known what going into private practice entailed, I probably would not have said that. But I was anxious to go back to court, and I was also anxious to do something. I felt as though writing opinions on are the Moonies really a church wasn't exactly my forte. So I went into private practice with Louis Farrell. He was 65 years old, and I was probably 27 or 28. He was brilliant. He was a Southern gentleman. He was a little irascible. And I learned a lot from him.
What kind of, well, first of all, let me back up and say, so you were general counsel for Jane Ann at the Department of Revenue?
I was a low staff attorney. I wasn't general counsel. I was low staff attorney. No, there were general counsels. Bill Norton, Mike Norton, he was not general counsel at that time, but he eventually became general counsel. And that's where I met Mike and introduced him. He had a good friend named Stan Chervin, who was an economist. They were good friends. And I introduced Stan to a friend of mine. And so I had a nice little group there.
Great. So that was a good experience.
Yes.
But you were ready to move on, and you went with
I didn't know I was ready to move on until he came, and then he asked me, and I said, okay.
So what kind of work did you do with him?
Louis had said that he would try to refer insurance work to me. He did suretyship and fidelity bond work, which is almost a specialty and a boutique type of practice. I had decided I wanted to do Title VII. I knew how to do domestic relations, so what I did is I decided to take domestic relations and use that as my revenue stream and do Title VII because it's such a delayed payday.
What's Title VII?
Title VII is the federal statute that prohibits discrimination in employment based on race, creed, color, national origin, sex.
Thank you. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no.
Yeah. You used the domestic relations as bread and butter while you
that's right.
worked
And
toward Title VII work.
I think the important thing is right in the beginning, I did not have a client base. I had no idea how I was going to get clients because there wasn't even lawyer advertising at that time, and it came into being probably first 2 or 3 years I was with Lewis, who really abhorred the idea. I did too. I think it was a base formed from my clients at Legal Services and a few lawyers that I knew who sent me people with a variety of problems. I did bankruptcies. I did consumer cases. I did home transactions, people who had problems with their homes, people who were trying to buy a home. I did a lot of small cases. The domestic cases seemed to become more paramount, but I did everything. If there was a car crash, I did that. One of the last cases that I had at Legal Services was representing an elderly man who had been hit by Harry Lester, a lawyer in town, in a pouring down rain, and Harry sued him, saying he stopped too soon at a red light and that his Lincoln had been damaged. And when I went to First Circuit, Judge Rutherford had to rule on Harry's motion that I wasn't entitled to represent him, and they removed me as his attorney, his legal services attorney. That went up to the Court of Appeals. Like 2 days later, they said it was error and I was back in. So we go back and Harry Lester files another one that the man wasn't indigent. And I thought, I think he's indigent. But he did have a 1955 Buick that Harry had run into. His car was not damaged. So I went out and checked out where this little man lived. He was pretty poor. He had a coal-burning stove in his house. He did have a house. He didn't have much. And so I went back and, again, I was removed. And that's about the time that I left and went with Jane Ann. But the case got reversed almost right away. They said the courts don't decide who's an indigent. You know, if Legal Services makes an error, they might lose their contract, but Legal Services decides who is an indigent. So I had learned, you know, how to be a little bit more assertive in going to court, and it was a lot easier to be an advocate for somebody than to be an advocate for yourself, I think.
Outstanding. So how long were you with Mr. Farrell?
I was with Lewis from 1975 to 1982, right about there. I told Lewis that I wanted to run for judge, and he said, great. There was going to be an opening. Steve North was stepping down. Steve North was the judge of the Fifth Circuit Court, and I thought that would be a very good thing to do. I'd been practicing about 9 years. Lewis said he would help me. He wrote a letter to all of the senior members of the bar telling them that he was supporting me and asking them for their support. This was my first foray into politics. I knew nothing about it. Again, I will tell you, I didn't know many people in Nashville. I knew the people I went to law school with. I knew my clients.
Were there any women judges then?
No. That was the year that Muriel and Barbara Haynes ran. I ran with them, but I lost the primary to Walter Kurtz, who then went on to beat Rose Cantrell, who had been appointed by Lamar to be the first woman appointed to the bench in Davidson County.
And you just made the decision to get into politics without any background at all in politics?
I also went to law school without knowing anything about law school, too. It's not like I did a lot of research.
So you ran for judge and lost? I
did. I lost. And I swore I'd never run again. The day after I lost, I went to the University of Tennessee where I had agreed to give a talk. And I thought, well, lesson learned, and just went on.
So what did you do then? Did you go back to Mr. Farrell?
I should mention that while I was with Lewis, one of the things that happened is that I had represented an elderly lady named Mary Northern in 1978. And Mary Northern was a woman who had been taken against her will forcibly from her home, put in General Hospital to be treated primarily for pneumonia and secondarily for frostbite. And about a week or two later, she developed gangrene, and the doctors wanted to amputate her 2 feet. She did not agree. So C. Allen Hyde, the chancellor of Part 2, called me up and said, would you be willing to serve as the guardian ad litem for Miss Northern? She's in the hospital. They say she's going to die. She needs this surgery. And I thought, I'd done that a number of times in probate. Hadn't done it really in chancery very much, but I had taken those kind of appointments. That case turned into an enormous amount of time, effort, energy. I almost had to ignore the rest of my clients, and there was tremendous media coverage, not only in Nashville, not only in Tennessee, but across the nation. I was getting tips on how to solve or cure gangrene from people in Australia, in Mexico, Europe. I didn't have time to pay attention to that because I was dealing with a lady who obviously knew what was going on and didn't want to have the surgery. She was there under a statute. She was in court under a statute called Protective Services for the Elderly, a public health statute that said imminent danger of dying, lacks capacity to consent. I looked at her feet and they were black as this tabletop. But she had the ability to consent, and she was not consenting. And I didn't think anybody should be able to make that decision for her but her. And so that had really been the first time that I had been thrown before the media. And as you mentioned earlier before this conversation started, there are times when you just decline to be before the media, particularly when you're involved in a case, and that taught me a lesson, a big lesson about dealing with members of the media. That, however, had also put my name before the public, so that led to thinking about, would anybody remember me if I ran for judge? And that is one of the factors that led me to think possibly I could put my name out there, particularly if there weren't very many people who were interested in running for judge.
So now let's get this in. Well, first of all, what was the outcome of the Northern case?
The outcome of the Northern case is that I lost at every level. I lost at the trial on the court level. 2 days later, we were in the Court of Appeals on a Saturday. I lost there. The next week, we were before the Tennessee Supreme Court. I lost there. They said I could go back to the trial court and have a full hearing, which I did. I lost there. Went back to the Court of Appeals. I started at the end of January, and by the middle of March, I am going back to the Tennessee Supreme Court. I'm still losing. I filed an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. On April the 15th, they said that she had sustained the gangrene and they weren't going to have to operate. And on May 1, she died of a blood clot.
Wow, what a story. What a story. Those are the things we never know are going to happen to us as lawyers.
We never know.
Chancellor Hyde just called you, gave you the opportunity to serve in that capacity.
I kept thinking that he was right, and I thought the doctors were right, that she was going to die. I didn't know that it was going to consume my life for 3.5 to 4 months, and it did consume my life. And it, in a way, my involvement with women's movement, again, was very instructive. I'd always thought that I would help women in employment, because if they can get a fair wage, they can pay for daycare, and they can get a good job if they have education. But then I saw what happens to women as they age. And this was a rapid experience about how people feel they know better than an elderly woman.
What year was that?
1978.
And so what was the atmosphere for a woman practicing law? How many women were on the Tennessee Supreme Court then?
Oh, there were no women on the Supreme Court. In fact, I don't think there were any on the appellate bench in 1978.
Right.
I will just move up to when I ran in 81 to get a position in 82. That's when Muriel Robinson and Barbara Haynes threw their hats in the ring too. Barbara ran for General Sessions and got elected, and Muriel got elected to the Fourth Circuit. That was monumental. Talk about someone who had to be a holder of the banner for women. Muriel Robinson did it with a lot of gusto and panache.
She and Barbara Haynes are
two
patriots.
That's right.
Right.
Two leaders.
So when you weren't judge, you were back to practicing law with Mr. Farrell?
That's correct. 1978, and then I went back to practicing until about 1981, and that's when I went in to talk to Lewis about running for a judge, and he said he would be very supportive of it. I did run, and during that time, I was out of the office quite a bit. Lewis, in the meantime, had also aged. I'd been there. I told you he was 65 when I came. He was about 73, and he was slowing down, and he said, you know, I think he actually did this, but I don't know for sure. Ed Davies, who is a wonderful lawyer, came to see me. Again, somebody comes to see me and said, you know, we've been watching you and we were wondering if you would like to come and work with us. And I was like, well, let me talk to Lewis. And that's when Lewis said, you know, he was slowing down. And so a law firm full of Republicans hired a Democrat that had no women, and I was their first woman.
And so who is us when you say Davies?
Right. It was Ed Davies, Cantrell, Pete Cantrell, Humphreys, Jerry Humphreys. At the time, there was another lawyer who was the city attorney for Belmead, and I'll remember his name in a little while. And this is the problem with too many years, is that the synapses get a little bit foggy.
So you went with that firm.
Davies, Cantrell, Humphreys, and McCoy.
And McCoy. And that was in like 1983 maybe?
Right about 1983.
And what type of practice did you have there?
There I had a civil practice, and again, it was rather widespread with the emphasis on Title VII. I did Title VII work, and the rest of my practice in the circuit courts was to generate, and I did bankruptcy up until the late 70s when they started the cram down, and I did not like that idea. I thought it was unfair, but I had served as a trustee in no asset cases. I had represented debtors. I had represented creditors. And I should mention, as a consequence of running for judge, I had met another individual. I had been divorced for about 8 years. I met Richard Chambers, who, in the middle of my campaign for judge that I lost, asked me to marry him. And I thought, this is really topsy-turvy. I need a little bit of time to think about this. We married about a year later, and I have 2 boys. He was a banker. He had majored in ancient religions at Brown University. He is one of the smartest people I've ever met. He is a person who keeps the cards close to his chest. He founded the Bank of Nashville after he left Nashville City Bank. The Bank of Nashville was acquired, and so he was president of 3 different banks in Nashville. As is true with all those acquisitions, sometimes those on top get moved on, and he did. He started his own company with Tom Irvin, the former manager at Channel 5. They made a very productive company and sold it. He is now in Atlanta after about 20 years. Sad to say, I think for some reasons I won't mention, the marriage ended.
So while we've taken that course, tell us about your boys.
I have 2 boys, Dwight and Davis. And as I said, I tend to have a positive view of the world, and I have 2 wonderful boys. Dwight is 34. He is an MD, PhD student. He has completed his PhD in pulmonary fibrosis, and he's now finished his 3rd year of medical school and getting ready to take the 2nd step of tests just before you apply for your internship, which he'll do this fall. My other son is Davis.
Where is he?
He is at Emory, and he got his PhD from Georgia Tech. Davis, my second son, is named for Davis Carr, who was his godfather. Davis Carr was a managing partner at the Bolt firm here in Nashville, which is now Arendt Brandt Bolt. Bradley, thank you. And sadly, Davis has passed on, but my Davis still carries his name. He's 31. He is at Des Moines University, and he is in his 1st year of medical school. No. He's starting his 2nd year of medical school. He just did. He's just started his 2nd year.
Great. Now, do you have grandchildren?
I have remarried. This is a very checkered past that I have.
Well, so first of all, with your 2 sons, do they have children?
No,
are they married?
Neither one of them are married.
Neither one. All right. Okay. So let's wait about your next marriage here for a minute, so I kind of keep this all in some kind of chronological order.
It's hard to. Yeah. Even I have trouble keeping it in order.
Well, what I want to know is, you were a woman practicing law in a man's world in the 70s and 80s, and you had children, and you had to balance your life. How did that work? And did anybody care?
I cared.
Yeah.
And I think I took 3 months off with each child, and I found out that it was true that if you have built your practice up, your clients don't really leave you. They're willing to, that you have a small break. I really didn't want to go back to practicing, but I did, and I found a wonderful woman in town, Miss Carter, who took care of my children. And the most telling thing about that is I'd probably been back to practice about a month, and she was taking care of my youngest. He was maybe 4 or 5 months old. The deposition that I was in started at 1:30 in the afternoon, and at 7:30 I came out, and I looked at my watch and went, "Whew, boy, that was a long deposition." And then I went, "Oh, I have a baby. Oh my gosh." And I ran to Miss Carter's house to get my baby. And she said, "Don't worry, I knew you were busy. I'll take care of him. You just do what you're supposed to do." So in a way, she became like a second grandmother. She made clothes for him. And when he was about 2, she said, "Now, when are you going to have another one?" And I said, "Miss Carter, I just don't know if I can handle it. If I have 2. And she said, "Well, I'll help you." And I said, "You will?" I decided we'd have 2. It takes 2 to tango, though, you know. So Ms. Carter was with us until the boys were about 6 and 8, and then her husband got very sick, and she said, "I can't take care of them anymore." So I did some creative thinking, and I went to Belmont. I called up their career placement person, and I said, "Do you have somebody that can help me pick my children up from after school care?" They went to Julia Green. At 3 o'clock, they'd go to after school care, but I didn't want my children to stay there till 5:36. So I had a wonderful student who I paid $25 a day to pick up my children. get them to do their little studies, fix them dinner, and I'd get home 6, 7, 8, and she'd be there.
Sounds like a very successful plan.
Well, we all seem to get along rather well. I will say that I have taken my children to work when they were sick and had to stay out of school. And I've lost quite a few pieces of clothing because babies threw up on me. And I don't think that any of my trials or tribulations as a mother were hardships, because you know what? It's just a moment. And so long as you can surround them with love and take care of them, I'm just sorry I didn't have about 6 or 7.
Beautiful. So how is it like being the only Democrat in a Republican firm? And was that the only Republican firm?
Oh, well, I don't know if it was the only Republican firm in town. No, I think there were probably a number of Republican firms, because I remember Macklin Davis. And I had a case against Macklin Davis, and I knew he was a big Republican. And here is a lesson for anybody that wants to know about practicing law. I was young. I represented the wife of an oral surgeon. Lots of money. She had been the other woman. 10 years of marriage. He had bathed her in jewels, but he'd also beaten her quite a bit. He was an alcoholic. She had pictures of all the bruises and everything. And what she did is she would go to the dog show at Westminster every year. When she came back, I had been representing her. She told me that her husband had taken all the furniture out of the house. He had taken everything. I called up Macklin and said, your client has taken everything out of the house. He needs to put it back. He said, you didn't take it, your client did. I said, no. So we had this little dispute. And we had answered interrogatories, and Macklin wasn't backing down. My client wasn't backing down. We went to court. I put her on the witness stand. We go through everything that had happened to her, introduced the pictures, talked about the marriage, talked about his assets. And I concluded probably 3:30, and Macklin got up and asked her, isn't it true that you have all of this stored in a warehouse somewhere? And he interrupted her testimony to bring her mother on as the corroborating witness and asked the same question. And then he said, Your Honor, we have a private detective that says everything's out there. I want an order sealing the warehouse. And Judge Harry Lester granted the order. We're going to go out there at 9 o'clock the next morning. I go out to tell my client. Macklin is left with his client. As we were leaving the courtroom, she turns to me and she says, it's all there. And I said, what do you mean it's all there? She said, all the furniture is in the warehouse. And I went, what? Now, mind you, I was not ready for that. I had such sincere belief in my client. I'd never had anything like this happen to me. So what did I do? The most important thing is I called somebody who was experienced. I called Louis Farrell. And he said, the first thing that you do is you have her write down everything that she's just told you and sign it and date it. The second thing you do is you call the judge. You do not tell him what she said because she might not say it tomorrow. You just say there's no need to go out to the warehouse and that your client has something that she wants to tell the next morning. When court convenes, you have her get up there and recant her testimony, and the mother too, which is exactly what I did. And then we recessed, and the case got settled for a lot less than she could have gotten. The importance of that is by having somebody like Louis as a mentor and as an advisor, he taught me an important lesson that if you don't know exactly what to do in a very difficult circumstance, ask somebody who has the wisdom and the knowledge about how you can handle a difficult situation.
We've been going about an hour. Why don't we take a little break?
All righty.
Carol, let's talk now about the latter stages of your private practice career before you went on the bench. Were there career-defining cases or terrific memories of specific cases during those years in the late 80s, early 90s that we need to talk about?
One or two cases, when you say defining, it's always difficult to look back and say this was a turning point. One case had to do with child abuse and a lot of notoriety, which was revisiting an earlier case with a lot of publicity and notoriety. Those lessons sometimes are very instructive and add a dimension to the practice of law that you don't normally anticipate. It's hard enough to deal with volatile facts and high emotions as between the parties, but when you have that third element of the public attention on it, it teaches you a lesson. I also continued to do Title VII work, and it was as I had anticipated, and that is that the blatant cases of discrimination against people of color or women or age began to fall by the wayside, and it became much more insidious and much more difficult to prove. But by the same token, the decisions coming out of the federal courts also changed how the proof was going to be scrutinized even more. So that when you have today's situation of a he said, she said, we tend to look at those cases in light of what has happened over the past 20 to 30 years in cases of discrimination.
And when you were working on all of these cases, did you have others helping you, or were you doing this almost all alone?
I didn't have any help. I sued the city of Chattanooga on behalf of a woman EMT who had trained all of the EMTs. She was a wonderful person. She was probably 32 or 33 when she came to me. She had a very attractive redhead. She had applied for the position. Chattanooga had taken all of its ambulances and put them in the fire halls as a result of a strike by the ambulance companies. She had worked at TVA. She'd started off as a nurse, and she had trained everybody. And so she went to the chief of the fire department, and he said, I'd like to give you a job, but... So she was allowed to be an EMT, but he put down the position as secretary. So she was working, she didn't care. She was working in the fire halls. She did a day shift for a while, then she did the night shift. And after about 2 years, there were some wives that began to complain about her. And he called her and he said, you can't be in the fire halls anymore. And she said, but I am an EMT. She'd been on the rides helping with the patients. And I was not successful in that lawsuit, but I did sue the city, and the city attorney had told her she had a great case, and he had stepped aside, so they had special counsel. There was no one that helped me in that lawsuit. And I had just tried to introduce statistical regression analysis because the only handbook that they had was from 1953, and the reason that they said they couldn't hire her was because she wasn't between the ages of 21 and 31. She was 33. And the reason that they said 21 to 31 is because they had used all men to demonstrate that this is such a high-stress position that these people would only have like 20 years worth of employment before they would go out, either because of medical reasons or health reasons, and they weren't going to hire her. It had nothing to do with the fact that she was a woman. Okay.
So, you had so many cases where there was a lot of media attention. What did you learn about dealing with the media in these cases?
I learned that there are people in the media who are really trying to do a good job, that they recognize that there is a story and they want to be able to find out all the secrets. But as an attorney, you can't tell all the secrets, that there are facts that you're not privileged to share, either ethically or maybe strategy. I think it's a great deal more difficult for people in the criminal side because those tend to be the sensational cases. I had a few that were civil and sensational. That doesn't happen that often on the civil side. I also knew that there are people in the media who do things strictly for the sensationalism. They want to sensationalize it because of ratings or whatever personal motives that they may have. And you learn to avoid those people, and you learn, just as there are people that you can confide in your life, there are people who in the media are also very knowledgeable and very educated, and you can also talk to them. But it takes a while before you have experienced that and can discern who it is that you might talk to and who you should not talk to. And therefore, you tend to be cautious most of the time about talking to anybody who might broadcast what you have to say. Given that we have Twitter now, I'm not sure that there's anything that isn't known to the world.
And known quickly. So, during this process, you continued a real interest in becoming a judge. So how did you begin to make the next step?
I will tell you that I had decided that I would not be a judge. I had 2 children. I was married. I had one of my most productive years. It was a very stressful case, but I had been litigating it, and we had a new federal judge. He had gotten appointed, Judge Campbell. I didn't know him. I thought I knew all the federal judges, so I wanted to see him. He had been appointed, nominated by Al Gore, and I went over to the courthouse to actually lay eyes on this new federal judge. It was packed. I couldn't lay eyes on him because I'm short, so I stood on a chair outside the courtroom and was looking in when I felt a tug on my sleeve, and it was Sarah Lee Woods who said, "Carol, come over here and talk to Larry." Larry Woods being the brother of Frank Woods and brother-in-law of Jane Ann Woods. I went over and Larry said, "Have you thought about running for Chancery Court?" Now this is January in the election year. Over the Christmas holidays, I knew that there was a vacancy. I had put my name in, but had been passed over. There were 11 candidates, and I did not come out as one of the 3. Of course, the governor was not of my persuasion either, but I thought maybe I had a chance. When Larry asked me if I'd thought about it, I said yes, but I've decided not to. And he said, "No, you have to run. That's the only way. We have to have a Democratic woman to beat a Republican woman."
Who was the Republican woman?
She is now Chancellor Lyle, but that's another story.
So?
What happened?
What happened?
I went home, I talked to Richard, my husband, and he said, "Well, why don't you?" So he calls Larry, and Larry says, "We'll introduce you to every Democrat who will help you," which happened on that was a Friday, that was a Saturday. On Sunday, I went to church, and I thought about it, and I thought, you know what, I'm happy, I'm content. So I called everybody up, from the congressmen to the county court clerks to all the people that I talked to, and said, "I really want to thank you for your time, but the answer is no." And on Monday morning, I got a call from Bill Covington, who was an elected official, and he said, "If you will run, I'll do everything. We'll get your nominating petition signed by everybody. You won't have to do anything. We'll put your signs up for you." This is like the week that you have to submit your petition on a Thursday, and this is Monday. And I said, "Oh, I just told people I wasn't going to do it." He said, "You need to do it." I said, "I'll think about it." So I didn't think about it. I was busy at work. I had too much to think about. On Wednesday night, Thursday noon is the qualifying deadline. Wednesday night, my mother calls and she says, "Well, honey, how's it going?" And I said, "Well, I've got all these people who want me to run for judge, and I just don't know." She said, "What have you got to lose?" And I said, "Well, nothing." She said, "Why don't you do it?" And I said, "Okay." So the next morning, before I went to court, I had to be in probate at 9, I called Covington and said, if you can have the petition here, I'll sign it. So he sends it over. I get back at 11. I sign it. Our runner takes it to him. At 20 to 12, he says, you didn't sign the second page. I run down there. It's like 10 minutes, 15 minutes. It's like 5 minutes to 12. I sign it, and I go back to work. The next morning, Pete Cantrell, my partner, says, why didn't you tell me you were running for judge? And I said, well, Pete, I didn't know it till yesterday. Just made up my mind.
So
since you're an experienced individual in politics, you know that's not the way it's done.
Not usually, but sometimes lightning strikes, right? So you became the Democratic candidate for chancellor.
After I beat a sitting councilman.
And who was that?
That is General Sessions Judge John Holt. John Aaron Holt. Excuse me. John Aaron Holt.
So you beat him in the primary.
Yes.
To become the Democratic nominee.
Yes.
And there must have been a major campaign there in a very short period of time that Bill Covington and Larry Woods and Sarah Lee and others.
There were so many people that helped me, primarily Richard Chambers. One thing about Richard Chambers, as I said to you, is he's one of the smartest people. He loves to raise money. He raises money for the Children's Hospital. He raises money for Brown University. He raised the money that was necessary for the campaign. He raised money to start one of the largest capitalizations of a new bank. I don't like to ask people for money. He wasn't shy about it. And of course, as a judicial candidate, you're not really supposed to ask people for money. So I was very blessed and benefited by that. But I had a lot of wonderful people who helped me. And I received a tip from Fate Thomas. I received tips from people who were in the mayor's office. It was a totally different race than I had when I ran the first time. And again, I learned a lot about politics through that experience. It was an education that you can't pay for.
And that was in 1996?
Correct. 95 to 96.
Right.
Right. Well, actually, it was 96 because I started in February of 96. That's right.
Right. That's what I was about to say.
It's very short.
Between
February and
August.
August.
And you ran against the woman who's
now
chancellor?
Now chancellor. At the time, Chancellor Lyle had been appointed by the governor to take C. Allen Hyde's place in Part 2, the chancellor that had appointed me in the Mary Northern case. I ran for that seat and won. Then in October, Chancellor Brandt in Part 3 said he was retiring and she was reappointed. Nobody applied for the position but her, so the nominating committee sent her name up and she got appointed. And then we were colleagues.
For several years.
Well, I was there for 20 years and she was too.
You're right.
She's still there.
What a coincidence. You never know about politics, right?
You never know.
So tell us about being on the bench for 20 years.
First of all, I will say that when you win and you have prevailed over an individual who is there, you have taken away somebody that they know. And I cannot say that people welcomed me with open arms in the courthouse. It wasn't that they were unhappy but there was no one to show you the ropes. And this is one thing about becoming a judge, whether you're appointed or elected. There is no one who tells you how to be a judge. There's no book that they give you. There's no one that tells you, here's the procedure that you're going to follow this week. I had the benefit of a wonderful calendar clerk who was a staunch Democrat and refused to work for a Republican appointee. And she knew everything about how the clerk's office worked. And I befriended the secretary of Bob Brandt and asked her to please help her train my secretary as to what she needed to know. I think that regardless of whatever position you have in life, that you need to understand those people that you work with, you need to make them into your friends. And I have always felt that when I draft something that is a legal document, if my secretary doesn't understand it, then I've made it too complicated. You need to be able to write for the ordinary person. You need to be able to communicate in ways that regular people understand. I made it a mission to get to know everybody in the clerk's office, and gradually it was a much warmer reception.
And were there lawyers or other judges that were helpful, either locally or statewide, who came to your aid to help you?
Well, I wish I could say that was true, but at that time, Chancellor Lyle had gotten divorced and she was dating Judge Kurtz, who was a popular fellow in the courthouse. And so it wasn't that people weren't polite, but there wasn't any mentor, either locally or anywhere else.
So there is a judicial conference, though, where they have some place where in secret they teach people how to be judges, or
there are two things. One is Baby Judges School in Reno, Nevada, and Baby Judges School in Tennessee. You usually don't go to those until you've been on the bench for a year or two. The one in Reno was 3 weeks, and they don't call it Baby Judges School. I do. It's judicial education. They actually had a class out in Reno that I found to be kind of like mini law school. You go back and you revisit most of the courses that you took, along with some procedure, heavy dose. They break you up into groups of 10 so that you are with other newly appointed or elected judges from a variety of states. And you hear how other states handle situations and how other judges handle situations. That's a very good exchange of information. The class that they have in Nashville was probably a week long, and it was at the Marriott or one of the hotels around here. It was a scaled down version of that, but more inclined, I think, to help those who were in the rural communities, because they have criminal and civil jurisdiction and they need the most help. The chancellors in Davidson County, I have to say, are the stepdaughters for all the CLEs. Well, maybe there's a stepson. But the reason that I say that is what chancellors in Davidson County do is so different than what anybody else in the state does, and it's a wonderful experience. I wish everybody could have had shared my experience, but you don't do domestic, you don't do criminal, you don't do probate, you don't do fender benders. You do cases that are new and unusual. You have some degree of repetition when you were doing workers' comp, but they've taken that away. So most of what you get, there isn't really any go-by. You have to research and you have to count on the lawyers to help you. I don't know of any position where everything I did in my 23 years of private practice was beneficial to me going forward, and yet everything that I did was new and different. Tax cases. I told you that when I went to revenue, I had no experience, and when I started handling appeals of tax cases, and not necessarily appeals, they're actually trying the cases, I had some initial reluctance because it didn't seem like it would be interesting to me. And as I began to read the memos that the lawyers had provided, it became a great deal more interesting because it was like a mystery. How is this going to turn out? Is this going to be a deduction? Is this an exemption? What are they doing? How are they handling their finances? It is worth the education. But if you think of a tax case as a mystery, it becomes much more enjoyable.
I'd say that's a pretty unusual description of a tax case, but
it's a good one.
That's great. So you sound like you enjoyed it, that you
Immensely.
liked your work.
I did indeed.
And you met the challenge to...
I think meeting the challenge is, in my opinion, the wrong way to phrase it, because people evaluate you in their own minds as to whether or not you met the challenge. I think that I tried to provide to anyone who came, a litigant or a lawyer, the type of hearing that I would like to have received if I had been the litigant or the lawyer in their court. When I went to federal court, the thing that I hated the most was when he said, because I had never had a she, "I'm going to take this matter under advisement." And I thought, you just heard the case. We've given you everything there is. Why can't you decide it? You know, you've got all the facts. You've got the law. So I had said to myself, if I can render a decision when the people are still there, that is my goal. There are some cases where you can't do that, where tax cases lend themselves to being taken under advisement. But you really should give these people, if you have prepared and you've studied everything and you've read those briefs and you know what the case law is, you should be able to give them a decision. And what I tended to do was to say, I've heard everything you have to say. I'm going to decide this right now. I'm going to review my notes. I'm going to review all the exhibits. If you want to sit in the courtroom, that's fine. If you want to go outside and wait. And I would sit on the bench, and they could look through the window, and they would see me making a decision. And that's what I would do. I'd make my notes about what I was going to say. Might be an hour. Might be an hour and a half. Might be 2 hours. Call them back in and say, this is the decision. And I will tell you that when you look at a party who has had an excellent lawyer, but they have manipulated the facts, or they haven't been forthright, and you say to them, your lawyer has done an excellent job for you, but they cannot create the facts in this lawsuit, and what you've done has been incredible. And you put that on the record, you haven't slammed the lawyer. But you can also take care of it if the lawyer has also been a little duplicitous. There are ways.
Now, why did you stay in the courtroom and do that rather than go to your office, to your chambers?
I think that I did it more as a personal preference. I do think judges get off and go back in their office, and people think, what is taking the judge so long? You sit on the bench, and they see that you are there with your paper and your pen, and you're not talking to your clerk, and you're not getting a cup of coffee, but you are seriously considering their case. That means something to them. And all they have to do is look and see that you're still up there working on the case, and nobody is bothering you. I have an ability to kind of be oblivious to my surroundings, so that when I start thinking, it doesn't matter if I'm sitting in this room with the shades down or the lights are up, or if I'm in a cement basement. If I'm thinking, I don't know what time it is, and I don't know how much time has passed, I'm just working.
Wow. So you were elected in 96.
Yes.
You were elected in 2004.
Correct.
Did you have opposition then?
No.
You were re-elected in 2012.
Correct.
Do you have opposition then?
No. 96, 2004. I had opposition in 2014. 96, and then in 98 I ran.
Oh, okay.
That's what
I
it
missed
was.
that one. Okay.
Yeah.
So you ran again in 90. You ran for a 2-year term in...
To finish out the term, and then I had to run again in the next general election.
And did you have opposition then in 98?
No.
Wow.
But in 2014, I did.
And who was that?
Well, I'm going to tell you another lesson of going on the bench, and that is, after I was elected, I went to see Frank Clement. He was the presiding judge, and he was not the presiding judge, but he was somebody I knew. And I said, Frank, if I'm sick and I'm going to be out of the office, miss some time, who do I tell? And he said, you don't tell anybody. He said, nobody is writing down when you're sick. And I said, but shouldn't I call and let somebody know that I'm not going to be there? I said, I'm never sick. But if I were to be sick, what do I do? You talked about a mentor. This is the big tip. He said, Carol, let me tell you, nobody cares what you do. You only report to the people every 8 years. And as long as you do not make a lawyer mad at you, you will have this job as long as you want it. You just need to treat the lawyers with respect, and because they're the only ones who can run against you. And I tucked that one away in my breast pocket and I went forth until about 2010, 2012, I had a lawyer that lied under oath in my court. Jim Roberts. I reported him in this fashion. He was sued by the lawyer in the lawsuit who was on the opposite side. And I thought, they are just squabbling about, I was just going to let it go. But this fellow got on the witness stand. He refused to answer the questions. He said it was attorney-client privilege. It was confidential. He must have said it 6 or 7 times that he wouldn't answer the questions. Well, the fellow shows up the next day and he says, no, he's not my lawyer. Now that is, that's pretty damning as far as, is it a yes or no question? Did he tell a lie or did he not tell a lie? I found him not to be liable for civil contempt, which is what they had sought, but I found him liable for criminal contempt. And that had not been sought, so I wasn't going to impose a sanction, but I found that he had been duplicitous, and he had lied to the court under oath, and I sent it off, and that was my opponent.
In 2014.
Right, and so Frank Clement's words come to bear truth.
And when you speak of Frank Clement, you're talking about Frank Clement Jr.
Correct.
So
now on the Court of Appeals.
Right, now on the Court of Appeals. So when you, there was a campaign, then that was in the Democratic primary, I assume, in 2014.
Actually, I think that person may have run as a Republican.
Oh, okay.
So
what was the outcome?
I prevailed.
And then you continued on the bench until 2016.
I did.
And why did you leave in 2016?
That was an even 20 years. One of the things I've noted about judges that stay too long is that even though they may have done a wonderful job, when you begin to slow down, and I didn't feel as though I was slowing down, but there has been a dramatic change in the practice of law. I had an opportunity to meet Justice Alito, and I said to him, what are we going to do about the serious decline in bench trials and jury trials in the civil courts? And he said, that is a really serious problem. What do you think is causing it? My anecdotal answer is based on what I have observed naturally. That is mediation, which I'm all for, arbitration, which I am dead set against, because all of the promises of arbitration have not been held up. It is not cheap, it is not quick, and to the extent that the lawyers can fight about it, it's not final. But it doesn't give people a right to an appeal. And the The third thing that has happened, and I think this is detrimental to our system of justice, is the increase in administrative hearings, because people think that they have a right to their day in court. They don't really appreciate that when they go to an administrative hearing, that is their day in court. And it might be that they have a knowledgeable panel, they might have a knowledgeable hearing officer, but I have done a number of administrative appeals, and I will tell you, it is like the wild, wild west as far as the caliber of either the panel or the hearing officers. Many of them, if you are a teacher at the University of Chattanooga with tenure, and they want to terminate your tenure, they will call in 3 people from a variety of departments, 3 of them, and that's your hearing panel. When I reviewed their decision, I'm looking to see, did they afford you a right to confront witnesses, and did they afford you a right to testify and cross-examine, and what are procedures you're entitled to? Was there something that was amiss? I do not get to look at the evidence and say, oh, you know, this evidence certainly weighs for you or against you. People think that they're still going to get their day in court, and that doesn't happen. I think that under the umbrella that taking things out of court will make it better does not hold up, because those types of hearing are not cheaper, they are not quicker, and the subsequent right to an appeal is very mutilated, shortened. I think that the public doesn't realize what's happening, all in the name of quick justice, and none of it is quick. That was one of the reasons that I said on the beginning. If I can make a decision when I've heard a case, I want to do it as quickly as I can, because the last thing people want is to have to sit and wait. You didn't ask me about this, but I'm going to tell you. I studied for that bar exam like everybody else did. We worked for 6 to 8 weeks to take the bar exam, and the worst part of it was waiting for the result. Just waiting. You're not doing anything. You tried your case, and you're waiting. You're waiting for a decision. I tried a case before Judge Nixon, and it took 18 months. And in that time, my client's position was filled, and she would have prevailed if we'd had the decision a month or 2 out. But because it was 18 months, we didn't even know it was coming up until after the entity had already filled. It was a state entity. They filled it, and we didn't even know it was open. She could have had that position. She wasn't in the executive ranks.
Do you think other judges are as attuned to this discipline that you have just described about considering their case and making decisions?
I'm going to tell you, one of the reasons that I retired is that when I started, at the end of the year, they would count up how many cases you had on your docket, and I had about 1,100, between 1,000 and 1,100 cases for that year. Full year would have been 1997. When I left, I had 205. I am not the only judge that had that experience. I'm not an incredible, get through with all the cases fast. That's true for every judge in Davidson County. There are judges over there that have very, very little to do. I do not like to sit around with nothing to do. I'm like everybody else. If I'm working on a case, there's more research you can do. There's more you can do. But it's not right, you know. If you're not busy, then you need to find something else that will keep you busy. I do like to stay busy.
So I want to talk about what you do now to stay busy, but I've got 2 other questions I wanted to ask. When you sat as a chancellor, did you have law clerks?
I had a law clerk. One. And ultimately, I was able to get a court officer Frank Clement became the probate judge, he had 8 court officers because Jim Everett, his predecessor, had done DUIs, for which he got 4 court officers. He was helping with the domestic docket, which he got 2 court officers, and then he had probate, for which he got 2 court officers. And when Frank stepped in, he said, I don't have a chair for everybody to sit in. They're on top of each other. I'm getting rid of them. And I said, whoa, could I have one? At the time, I had a woman who was my law clerk. I had a secretary who was a female, and the hormone level was really high. I thought a little testosterone would equal things out. And I got a court officer. And Jack Gunter, former publisher of the Banner, who was
your court officer?
Yes, for about 7 years. And he, for whatever I did not know about Nashville, he knew.
Oh boy.
And I do not think that Jack shared all of his secrets with me. He did tell me an awful lot. And then one day he came in and said, I'm retiring. I said, when? He said, in about 10 minutes. So I called up Pete Cantrell, my former partner, and said, Pete, who was getting ready to wind down, and I said, would you be interested in being a court officer? And he said, I think I would. And so a fellow who was a lawyer, interested in lawsuits, interested in lawyers, and still the librarian at the Nashville School of Law, became my court officer.
Great story, yeah. So during that process, did you have the opportunity to appoint other young lawyers as you had been appointed, like by Chancellor High or others in those cases you talked to us about earlier?
Early on, I could make an appointment or 2, but the type of cases which call for an appointment, like guardianships, they were transferred down to probate. Mm-hmm. And so it ended up that the only time I would ever appoint somebody might be if we had a receivership. That's in primarily insurance companies, and the department already has someone in mind to do that. I had occasion to appoint Bob Eccles in a case one time, and I had occasion to appoint John McLemore, in which I had a family squabble and there was lots of property that needed to be disposed of. But
so,
not very.
So let me ask you this. This is a dangerous question, but are there 3 or 4 lawyers who practiced in your court that you thought were really great?
Yes.
That you would want to name for?
I say yes, but I really don't want to say who they were, because those who are great and think they're great, and if I don't name them, will feel left out, and I might accidentally leave them out. But I will tell you this. Chancery Court has the benefit of the best lawyers and the brightest lawyers in Tennessee. And they also have the benefit of some of the most ethical lawyers in the state and I think in the country. I don't think anybody truly appreciates the wonderful experience of sitting as a chancellor in Davidson County. We handle the lawsuits involving the metropolitan government, the state of Tennessee. We handle insurance companies. We handle environmental claims. We handle tax cases. We handle music cases. We handle contracts between people who can't speak English and contracts between people who have spent tens of thousands of dollars. I had a case in which these 2 multimillionaires had been partners. Each of them had 17 lawyers, 2 or 3 law firms on the respective sides, to settle how they were going to divide everything out of the debacle in 2008, 2009. They were heavily invested in real estate. CPAs, lawyers, And one of them, after everything is signed, sues the other and says it wasn't fair, things hadn't been adequately disclosed. That case took a long time, but I'm telling you, the variety and the talent, the legal talent that comes, I just stand in awe. When I read, I told you that writing is one of those things where I have really worked very hard. Chancellor Lyle is somebody who I think writes very well. And I have observed how she organizes her papers and how she constructs her decisions. I will say that every judge has strengths and weaknesses. I'd like to think that my strength is that I always have an open mind. I told a dear friend, Andre Blumstein, that I had been on the bench for about 3 months and I was listening to this plaintiff testify. I take copious notes and I was writing. I was saying, man, what a story, writing and writing. And then the defendant got up there and it was as equally compelling. I was thinking, wow, I wonder who's going to win. And then I realized I had to decide who was going to win. Now, I told her that because that's really the kind of judge that I want to be. I had not made up my mind. I had read everything. I knew what the lawsuit was about. But you have to hear the testimony, and you have to listen to all of the evidence because lawyers have a way of crafting their memorandums to get the outcome that they want. And judges can also craft decisions to have it come out the way they want. I like to think that when I was working on a decision that I had brought that same attitude, who's going to win, to find the right answer. And if I failed, it wasn't because I had pre-decided. I decided it based on what I knew and what I thought my instructions were, not in the handbook on how to be a judge, but on my whole legal training.
Well, now did you ever consider looking at an opportunity at a higher court?
I will tell you that I have never aspired to go up to a higher court, and I will tell you the reason. I had, through the assignments at Chancery, had to work part-time as an appellate judge on administrative appeals. They would bring in boxes and boxes, and you go through that administrative record and you look at the decision, and then they come in and they argue their case just as they would as though it was an appellate court. I would do my utmost to review what had happened. You don't frequently overturn an administrative appeal unless, and I will tell you, you do when you see mistakes, you have to. But for the most part, you're going to be cautious in your rulings. That did not appeal to me at all. I really wanted to hear cases and try cases, and I've already told you how that has fallen off. One of the last cases that I tried was 2 weeks before I went off the bench between two healthcare companies that have to do with highly trained staff that assist neurosurgeons and brain surgeons when they are operating these attendants, OMIs or OSIs, or they are right there reading the monitor and assisting the surgeon. There were 3 companies. One went bankrupt, and these 2 companies had bid on the assets, including the contracts, the physicians, and the staff. And one thing that we know is that, like hairdressers, physicians really tend to like the tech that they're used to working with. So if you can get that contract at that hospital or with that physician, and company defendant had breached the due diligence order that they had signed, that they would not violate what they found out until after it had been awarded, and company plaintiff had gotten the award and found out that for 4 months, company defendant had been siphoning off all of the physicians and the hospitals and the techs. And that's what the lawsuit was about. It was very, very bitter. And it was so exciting. And that's what I was really thrilled about as far as trying cases, is listening and participating in a trial. Not that a judge participates, but you really do have to stay focused, and you have to be attentive to what people are saying. I had never, ever gotten a trial that went on punitive damages beyond a motion to strike, and I would usually dismiss it if they didn't withdraw it. In this one, the punitive stages went to the jury, and after giving compensatory damages of about 2.8, almost 3 million, they gave 17 in punitive damages. And in the punitive stage, the defendant's key witnesses got on the stand and cried. They each acknowledged that what they did was wrong, that they would never do it again. There had been destruction of evidence, computers, cell phones, efforts to deceive. I mean, it was as good as Perry Mason.
So it was time to go home.
Time to go home.
So let's take a break.
Okay.
Carol, tell us, not just after you've left the bench, but what have been your real passions in the community? Because I know you've been involved in any number of activities and community involvements.
I have to say that issues that impact women in their lives have been a primary thrust of my personal interests. And when I was right out of law school, Dean Wade's wife was on the League of Women Voters, and I got pulled into that early on. I was one of the few, quote, women lawyers in town, and the Equal Rights Amendment was being considered by the various legislatures. Phyllis Schlafly was coming to town. I was learning about why we needed the Equal Rights Amendment, and did go up and for the first time ever speak to legislators, and was astonished at what I thought was a baffling mindset, that they wouldn't think that it was just a foregone conclusion that you should have the Equal Rights Amendment, that women should have the same rights as men. I didn't understand why there would be such animosity, but animosity is a mild term to some of what I experienced. I went to West Tennessee to debate then Senator from Chattanooga, I can't remember, on the Equal Rights Amendment. I'm not a debater. I had no idea what I was doing. But I went, and one of the things that I told myself is, each time that you make yourself take a position, talk about it, express it, you can learn to improve. You can become a better communicator, orator. I am not a gifted speaker, but I know that saying is not something that people want to hear you say. I know that I have a way of fracturing, or maybe that's not the right word, fracturing sentences. But I think people get the gist of what I am trying to say. I have always said I've had dyslexia of the tongue because I twist words or phrases, but all the words are in the sentence.
So, what about the arts?
I love the arts. And I have, from the time I first came to Nashville, participated in what was the Old Symphony, was a member at Cheekwood. They didn't have the Frist at the time, but I think part of traveling and seeing what other cities and countries have to offer, how beauty is defined in different parts of the world and what attracts, why is Southwest art so different than the art of the Northeast? Or what happened in Atlanta and why is their art different than that of Anchorage, Alaska?
And what about, like, weren't you a part of the Sister Cities program?
I am right now on the board of Sister Cities and have been for a number of years. That was fortuitous because I went with the Nashville Bar Association on their trip to Caen, France, where you get to see Omaha Beach and you get to see Normandy, and you learn how much those people appreciate what our soldiers did during World War II. To me, that's history. To them, it was part of their parents' lives. It was personal. And just having read a book called A Woman of No Importance, a woman who was a spy in World War II that served in the resistance, her name was Virginia Hall, and nobody knows her. And just listening to what that woman did during World War II, you can understand why the French feel the way they do about the Americans, or at the time that I went. And through that, Gail Ashworth asked me if I'd like to be on the board of Sister Cities. And I said, well, sure. And I have thoroughly enjoyed it because we have gone to Japan, as I mentioned, with the mayor. Briley is our current mayor, and he was one of the former presidents of Sister Cities. His mother has been on the board. We have 2 or 3 sitting council people, because in order to be a sister city, there has to be a twining between the governing body and their chief official with the other sister cities governing body and their chief official. And it is a very nice twining ceremony.
Great. Now, what about, you mentioned the book you're reading or have read, but are you a reader?
I am a big reader, but as I told you, I'm not much for fiction. Although, when I am driving from here to Jackson, which I do pretty frequently, my husband, Roger Page, who I think is such a sweetie, lives in Jackson because he's a judge. And when I met him, he was a trial judge who had civil and criminal jurisdiction. And I met him at the judicial conference. I met a lot of judges at the judicial conference. As I said, law school was 162, of which there were 4 women. When I joined the judicial conference, there were about 182 judges, of which maybe there were 25 who were women. And I got to know almost every one of them. And I was the first woman president of the judicial conference. I did not realize that you had to be kind of designated because it's 3 years before you actually become the president. And at that time, we were having a lot of turmoil. There was a shift going on in the legislature between Republicans and Democrats. There was a shift occurring, but not as evident at that time because it was like 2009, 2010. I made it my duty to try and promote collegiality amongst the judges. And I will tell you that if you are going to do CLEs for judges, you want them to come to the sessions and you want them to pay attention. And my method of encouraging attendance was, because I love to give stuff away, was to go and buy. Throughout the year, I'm a great purchaser, if I may say so.
Shopper.
I can find a deal. And I have 2 boys, so I found out that men like things for shopping and their cars and tools and gadgets. And also fun things. And I would wrap them up. And everybody who would come to one of the seminars would just drop their name in. And at the end of the hour and a half or so, we would pull out 8 names. And if you were there, you got a prize. If you had been through the entire CLE. And after about 2 or 3 of these we have 3 that you go to in a year. And I think it was at the end of the second time, we probably had about 3 classes, and this judge from Memphis comes up to me, Jerry Stokes, and he's very tall and lanky, and he says, "Chancellor, was it your idea to have these gifts?" And the way he said it, I thought I had offended him in some way. I thought he was upset about it. He was so serious. And I said, "Yes." He said, "Do you notice how everybody sits up when you get ready to draw the names? We're just like in kindergarten. We all want our names to be drawn." Made me feel a whole lot better. But I do like to give things that are useful and entertaining. So
there's this guy named Page who was a judge?
There was a fellow named Roger Amos Page. He is one of the smartest men I've ever known in a different way. He is very amiable, very cheerful. He is a country boy. And in that sense, he's country like my daddy was country. He's a Baptist. I'm a Catholic. He's a Republican. I'm a Democrat. I can't say that we had a lot in common except our amiability. And I had been divorced for about 2 years. We went out. Now, I don't see this fellow very often because, of course, it's like 3 times a year. We started dating, I think, about a year after he got divorced, and he's a pharmacist. He went to the University of Tennessee at Martin for 2 years, transferred to UT Memphis, which at that time had a school of pharmacy, but you did not do a degree program and then go on to pharmacy school. It was, you just did your 3 years of pharmacy school. He thought that what he would do is teach pharmacy law, because once he'd gone into pharmacy school, he had a professor that said one of the things that you might consider is go to law school. Well, he graduated with his degree in pharmacy. He thought about it. He was working at Walgreens in Memphis, became a manager, started going to University of Tennessee, Memphis Law School now, and ended up graduating, clerk for Julia Gibbons. He was her second law clerk. Sometimes they mistook him for the judge instead of Judge Gibbons because they were both real young. And then he went to work for a law firm in Atlanta. He did that for about 2 years, and he was just homesick. He had to go home. And one thing that I really like about Roger is the way he treats other people. He is so kind, whether you are the top dog in the biggest show or you're just the attendant at the car wash. He is just nice to everybody. And that means a lot to me. The second thing that means a lot to me is how close he is to his family. And because of my upbringing, the people that I know the best are my family. And that's who I grew up with. That old saying that you can disagree and have arguments with your family, but don't let anybody else say anything bad about them, is so evident in my family. Only in his family, they never say anything negative about each other. Roger might say something to me about his brother or his sister, but that's about as far as it goes. They're just a very close family, and I love that too.
And where are they from, Jackson?
No. When I met Roger, he said he was from the Tri-Cities area, which to a girl born in Kingsport, Tennessee, one would think Kingsport, Johnson City, and Bristol. No, the Tri-Cities area for him is Luray, Mifflin, and Huron, which I doubt very many people in Tennessee actually know where they are unless you've been in Henderson or Chester County. So they're somewhere out there. I have been to Mifflin because that's where his mother lives. I have been to Luray because he wanted to show me part of where he grew up. I don't think I've been to Huron. I don't even know where Huron is. But he is really country.
And he's on the Tennessee Supreme Court.
He is in the Tennessee Supreme Court, and he is a junior member. He's been there for 3 years. He was on the trial bench for 11 years. He did civil and criminal, and he traveled 3 counties. He then got appointed by Governor Haslam to be on the Court of Criminal Appeals, where he was for 3 years. And then Governor Haslam later appointed him to the Supreme Court. He wasn't sure that he wanted to be on the Supreme Court, and I did encourage him. In my opinion, he writes extremely well. He writes so succinctly, so to the point, and his decisions are so rational that I think anybody would benefit by him being on the Supreme Court. There are some judges that think if you write 180 pages, you're doing a benefit to somebody, and the answer is no, because other people have to read what you write. And if you can write it succinctly, cogent, thoughtfully, you do everybody a big service. But he worked his way through law school by being a pharmacist, which served him well because he knows so much about medical mal. The lawyers, he has a phenomenal memory.
So you all commute?
Yes,
occasionally.
We commute.
You have a place here and a place in Nashville and a place in
I think
Jackson?
Actually we are related because we built a house down in Jackson, and I love this house. It's a pretty big house. When we went to pick things out for the house, we were in New York picking out some furniture, and we decided we would get a chandelier in a store where all these chandeliers are hanging in the top of the ceiling and the rest of it's antiques at the bottom. And I had wandered off to look at rugs, and he had wandered off to look at furniture, and I looked at some chandeliers, and I guess he did too, and I said, I have found the chandelier. He said, I found one too. And I said, well, come with me and let me show you what I found. And we both picked the same one.
Wow.
You've heard stories about people building houses and they just, destroys a marriage. We didn't disagree on anything. And he doesn't like avocados. I don't like avocados. He doesn't. There are things that he doesn't drink coffee. I don't drink coffee. So there's got to be something genetically related.
Got to be something. But you have a place in Nashville as well.
We have a big house in Nashville. We have a big house in Jackson.
Yeah, okay. So are there other couples who are judges in Tennessee? Do we have any other?
Yes, the Ogles. There's Judge Ogle and Judge Ogle. Norma Ogle is on the Court of Criminal Appeals, and Rex Ogle is a trial judge, and they live in the same city.
Okay.
And let me think if there's anybody else.
Judge Kurtz?
Oh, yes, they don't. Judge Kurtz and Chancellor Lyle. They are also, but he now is retired. So I don't think he is doing any more senior judge appointments. But after he retired, Walter undertook, I think for 4 or 5 years, to be one of the senior judges. And that's appointed by the Supreme Court, and they travel where a judge has a conflict or if they're ill and fill in for them. And I think he might have, no, it was another judge that did that from East Tennessee.
All right, let me come back. So up and down I-40, do you read or listen to books?
I am listening to Hamilton right now.
Okay.
I have listened to Churchill, 42 discs of Churchill, and I will say I never wanted it to end. It was one of the best histories. I do a lot of histories. And occasionally I will do something like Dark Money, which is about the Koch brothers. And if you haven't read it, you really do need to read about how money is influencing our public life. Charles Mellon Scaife, the woman who is the current Secretary of Education, how they made their money off of these private schools that basically for-profit schools that took the money that should have been used for scholarships and had students borrowing the money from the federal government, and now they cannot discharge that in bankruptcy. There's a book called An American Sickness, written by a physician who talks about the state of our medical care in the United States. And as she said, when you go to medical school, you learn first to take a history, and then you do your diagnosis. So she goes through the history of how physicians started, how hospitals started, how insurance companies started, how the government got involved, and how insurance companies started. And as she said, there were good intentions with most of them. She is a graduate of the Harvard Medical School and became a physician at NYU. I think, she doesn't disclose this in the book, but I think because her daughter had some type of serious health condition, probably in her teens, she became aware of the enormous difficulties that people have as patients, not just with the treatment, but also with the expense. And here's a little blurb. Medication has become very expensive. Big pharma, controls a lot of the prices. And there are people in the United States who try to get their drugs from outside of the country, even though it's illegal. In the back of her book, she tells you how you can find reputable places in other countries to get your meds.
So while you're on health, let's talk about fitness.
Oh, right.
Because you have a commitment to fitness personally, right?
Well, I never went around telling people like that, but when I was young, I loved sports. I taught myself how to play tennis, and when I was in the 9th grade, I was invited to the sports banquet because I had lettered in so many sports. This was in Wisconsin. And you get to invite your parent to go. So I asked my mother, no, my daddy, no. So I went by myself. I didn't realize that the sports banquet was primarily for fathers and sons. I was like one of 3 girls there. They had some parents. I love sports, and I love being active. So I have always been involved in playing tennis or riding a bicycle or being a jogger when I could jog. And now I am a walker because I have reached that right part of my life where you do not want to hurt your knees or your back. And I also know that it's good to do yoga, as we have discussed earlier. I do yoga on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I do the weight or strength training. I have given myself permission not to do burpees anymore. I just don't like them.
Me too.
And I am not a fan of chaturanga down 37 times in yoga. I don't mind doing, 10 or so, but when we get up to 35 or 40, that's for somebody else.
Wow. Now, where do you do this?
I go to the YMCA in Green Hills. I have favorite instructors. And then after I do that, I usually go walk in Percy Warner for about an hour. We do about 3 miles, maybe 4, 3, pushing 4. And it used to be that we would do the 5.8 on Saturdays and Sundays, but other people have gotten cranky and complained about plantar fasciitis and bad backs and bad knees, and I think maybe my day is coming. But
maybe it's younger friends, maybe. Wow. So you have a very active life now.
I think it's pretty active. Roger,
do you teach now?
I don't teach, but I am thinking, I've had a thought of how to be more useful. What I have found is that when you leave your job, I I lost the contact with the people. I lost the structure of my day. And that's one thing about working, regardless of what you do. Work gives you a structure. You go in and you know that certain things are going to happen. There are always interruptions, but you have a structure. Going to these classes gives me a little bit of structure in the beginning, but then how do you prove that you are productive? To yourself. You don't have to prove it to anybody else. I do feel as though I want to, again, why did I go to law school? To help other people. And that's what I'd still like to do. I have approached a fellow that was my employee for a while, and now he's a lawyer. And I said, I don't want to keep track of my time. I don't want to bill people. Don't want to answer the phone. But I will be glad to help you. And I'd say that to you too. I can't really practice law because Roger's on the Supreme Court and if my name shows up anywhere, that's kind of like, you're just asking for trouble. I have just listened to the woman who is the president at Nashville State out on White Bridge Road. They have a new program called GRAD, in which she is trying to overcome the decline of African American males who do not graduate. They start off in the first year, and by their third year, 60% of them have dropped out of school. Many of them because they don't have a support system, they don't know what's expected, they have nobody in their family who's ever gone to college, and I thought, maybe I'll go talk to her. So I am looking at what ideas there are that I could explore to be a useful person in society.
I'm sure you won't have any trouble finding many opportunities.
I know. What I want to do is be on a for-profit corporate board because I've done so much in the nonprofit world. I really would like to do that, and I think my experience on the bench and everything that I've learned, as I've said before, could be a benefit to a company that is growing, is involved and being productive, even those kind of companies that are having internal turmoil. I think there are lots of lessons that I could share with them and give them some insights and direction. In addition to, I don't mind reading rules and regulations or reading what's on the agenda and all of the backup documentation. I can read a lot.
Congratulations. What a great story. Is there anything else is there anything I haven't asked you that you would like to say?
I want to say thank you.
Thank you.